Our final speaker this afternoon is Marian Kaplan. Marian Kaplan received her PhD in Modern European History from Columbia University. She has taught at the City University of New York as well as NYU. In 2012, she won a Golden Dozen Award for teaching from the College of Arts and Sciences. Kaplan's research concentrates on Jewish women's history and the history of Jewish daily life in Germany. Her publications are based on archival sources, but also on ego documents such as diaries, letters, and memoirs that express feelings and personal perspectives, along with the crucial details of daily life. Among her more recent books, Dominican Haven, the Jewish refugee settlement in Sosua from 1940 to 1945, published by the New York Museum of Jewish Heritage in 2008, and Jewish Daily Life in Germany from 1618 to 1945, published by Oxford University Press in 2005. And she will talk this afternoon on From the Comfort of Home to Exile, German Jews and Their Foodways.
Thank you. I'm going to have to move over and push this thing, right? Okay. All right, this is my first time on PowerPoint, so bear with me. So we're moving from Eastern Europe and the tenement, Lower East Side, to look at German Jews over about a 100-year period from the 1870s to the 1970s. We're going to look at them first in Germany, then as they flee the Nazis, and some of them wind up in Portugal, and some of them wind up in the Dominican Republic, and then many of them wind up in the United States. So these are little samples. It's not like they all went to those places. A little gray metal file box sat in my closet for years. I recognized it from my childhood as my mother's trove of recipes. As she aged, she could no longer cook, and I had no time either to inspect her or my culinary history. But last year, upon her death, the box beckoned. What I found concurred with my own discoveries about Jewish food cultures in Germany, in temporary havens from Nazism, and as new immigrants in countries of refuge. I found that in all of these diverse environments, German Jews both adapted to new cuisines and customs, as well as continued certain food traditions. In Imperial Germany, newly unified in 1871, Jews sought both to integrate, but also to retain their ethnic or religious identities. They desired to acculturate to German middle-class habits and politics, acquiring and displaying appropriate German manners, educations, and attitudes in order to prove to a reluctant German polity that Jews could be and should be treated as the new citizens they had recently become between 1866 and 1871. Notwithstanding their successful acculturation, Jews' maintenance of certain food customs, and in particular, family gatherings around the Sabbath and holidays, indicated their aspiration to both enact community and retain aspects of their Jewish identities. Later, during Nazi persecution and while fleeing for their lives, Jews maintained a similar course, keeping elements of their old foodways while adapting first to severe shortages in Germany and later to new food customs in countries of temporary and later permanent refuge. Jewish cookbooks from the Imperial Era, the one behind me, illustrate that many German Jews eagerly attaining middle-class status performed their Germanness by aspiring to middle-class norms. This is the title page of a 1903 cookbook that went through many editions. With or without kosher ritual food regulations, or with their own modifications of these laws, like the 1-hour Sabbath stew that ritually should have taken 24 hours to cook. These cookbooks also focused on the types of foods to serve to guests, even the way to fold cloth napkins attractively, for example, into a swan. Earlier cookbooks offered thrifty meals, and later ones provided both traditional recipes but also finer dishes, and international fare, such as English plum pudding or French almond cake. Oh, you just did it? Okay. Maybe I should do it though, just so that you don't run away with me. Okay. Some of these cookbooks explain the rules for keeping a Jewish kitchen, explaining to presumably modern women that science and religion could coexist, which is what Rakefet was just talking about. And reminding them that koshering meat had sanitary, quote, healthful, quote, reasons too. So these are how to make your kitchen kosher, and this is how to make meat kosher, and this is how to handle chicken before cooking. And today we also get all kinds of instruction about how to handle chicken, so it's interesting to see it there as early as 1903. Frequently, these cookbooks included recipes for Easter, which the German word is Oster, or the Easter kitchen, although upon closer inspections, these turned out to be traditional foods meant for Passover. Like matzah, a matzah cake, matzah shallot, this is the second kind of matzah shallot, this is the third kind. They have all different kinds of matzah shallot. In fact, in some, the Hebrew letters for Passover, Pesach, appear in parentheses after the word Easter, and the recipes include matzahs. This confusion resulted from linguistic acculturation. Easter even appeared in books with kosher recipes and even with prayers in Hebrew to be spoken on the Sabbath and other holidays. Memoirs describe unusual food and ritual combinations. For example, a German Jewish woman could write in her memoirs about Christmas pudding and special Sabbath meals without exhibiting any contradiction. Walking a tightrope between acceptance of German pork-centered cuisine, we're going with pork again, and Jewish prohibitions against pork, many rejected pork based on aesthetic grounds, but ate other non-kosher meat. Others refused to have dairy with meat dishes because, quote, they didn't taste good together. These instances display a de facto allegiance to traditional Jewish foodways, even as most Jews observed them in the breach. In villages, Jews cooked German regional and national variations, and non-Jews picked up some Jewish recipes. For example, in Württemberg, village peasant women baked a plum cake called bubala, a southern Jewish recipe. In Hesse, the peasants enjoyed a bean stew, probably a form of the Sabbath shallot, and would say, quote, today I'm a Jew. Swabian Jews, on the other hand, enjoyed the local specialty dumplings, or well known as spätzle, and prided themselves on cooking them as well as other Swabians, but they ate them on work days, not on the Sabbath, whereas their neighbors ate them on Sundays. Jews could not cook on the Sabbath, and these dumplings had to be prepared fresh. By the 1920s, the Jewish midday Saturday meal often resembled the middle-class Swabian Sunday dinner, with the exception of Jewish bread or challah, which they called berches. Conversely, German non-Jews noticed that Jews ate certain foods in, for them, unusual combinations because of the rules against combining milk and meat. In cities, Jews had many more food options. The family of Chief Rabbi Joseph Karlebach in Hamburg, for example, maintained kosher standards but ate, quote, half a la Berlin and half a la North Sea fish. But they dined on traditional dumplings for the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. By the turn of the century, the majority of urban Jews no longer obeyed most of the laws of kashrut, the kosher laws, but a form of gastronomic Judaism persisted, often to appease the older generation or to ease their own consciences or from tradition. Most commonly, they seem to have agreed about what they could eat inside in private, you talked about this, Hasia, or outside in public, the latter offering more non-kosher options. These compromises could bring strange contradictions. One memoirist noted that with regard to his mother's kitchen, quote, I would set the word kosher in quotation marks. Although my father refused to eat pork, he ate ham. And you made that point earlier too. Nowhere do we see the adoption of food habits more clearly than in the German Jewish adherence to the German ritual of the coffee and cake hour, which may explain the diabetes Rakefet talked about. Coffee hour grew to one of the main forms of social activity among German-speaking Jews, as among other Germans, in the late 19th century. One Jewish cookbook recommended 4 to 5 pies and 2 platters of assorted baked goods for 24 women. Indeed, in the Complete Israelite Cookbook of 1903, the author listed 208 meat, vegetable, and salad recipes, so 208, compared to 368 cake and dessert recipes. It is no wonder then that a recent researcher found the majority of orally transmitted recipes in her grandmother's cookbook to be cookies, cakes, and torten. In general, Jews continue to enjoy traditional meals and to observe some dietary rules disguised as preferences. They aspire toward a German and international menu to testify to their embourgeoisement, or their arrival in the middle class. Yet food alone would not have sufficed to maintain a connection with Judaism. The family meal remained a central focus for the expression of Jewish feeling and commitment. Women made special arrangements for the holidays, with most rural and observant women taking special care for the weekly Sabbath. The Sabbath for them entailed white tablecloth, candles, special clothing, and importantly, family gatherings. Particular foods and rituals combined religious and familial celebrations. These two elements reinforced each other, impossible to disentangle. For example, even lower middle class, relatively modest families made Sabbath meals into minor banquets. A letter from newly-wed Sigmund Hirsch to his wife Rosa in 1895 described the Sabbath he spent with her family in the tiny village of Flaumloch in Swabia. She was one of 7 children whose father ran a small cigar business from home. Hirsch wrote that on Friday evening they had a meal of soup, beef, asparagus, bean salad, chicken ragu, roasted capon, a meat roll with chicken sauce, salad, and a variety of desserts. On Saturday, synagogue started at 8 a.m. Thereafter, the family took a short walk before the main Sabbath meal, then ate dumpling soup with soup meat, asparagus, celery, and carrots, cucumbers and horseradish, 5 types of preserved pike, tongue with peas, roast goose, salad with hard-boiled eggs, cherry pie, fruit, and coffee. Hirsch decided he would not eat again, or he would get sick. The meal served as a connection to family and Jewishness, if not always to religious observance. One woman wrote of the 1880s in Berlin, quote, "Besides the ceremony of Friday nights, there was a strict rule of family togetherness." And then here I have one picture of an older family. Anti-Jewish persecutions from the Nazi era caused dramatic shifts as families shrank. The Nazis disrupted family gatherings, which grew smaller and more infrequent as individuals fled Germany any way they could. Additionally, the major food issue focused on finding nutritious alternatives, as foods were restricted to Jews. Aware of the Nazi ban against kosher meat slaughtering in April 1933, Jewish newspapers tried to give nutrition tips, with one coining the slogan, quote, "Fish is also meat." Advice columns suggested that housewives consider vegetarian menus because they were cheaper and healthier. Although meat might be easier to prepare, columnists asserted that, quote, "Goodwill was an important assistant in a vegetarian kitchen." And papers printed vegetarian menus. The League of Jewish Women, the organization of the Jewish feminist movement in Germany, wrote its own cookbook in 1933, including the use of nuts as a meat replacement. It went through 4 editions by 1934. By 1937, the League's winter menus placed a heavy emphasis on apples, potatoes, and cabbage. A typical menu for the day included oatmeal for breakfast, cabbage stuffed with rice and steamed apples for the main meal, a salad, a hard-boiled egg, and some cooked plums for the evening lighter meal. As Jews faced further economic decline and later impoverishment, the issue turned on what could they buy and what could they eat at all. Serious limitations on shopping began in 1939, 10 days after the start of the war, when Jews could only shop in particular stores. Some cities then set up Jew shopping locations in districts with a large Jewish population. In addition, the malicious combination of assigning Jews to shops a long distance from their homes and the ban on Jews using public transportation meant that as of mid-1941, Jews faced hour-long shopping marches, they called it. It grew time-consuming and enervating to obtain even trivial items. Severe rationing also restricted consumption. This is a ration card for all Germans, but more so for Jews. As of 1940-41, Jews could no longer purchase rice, legumes, canned vegetables, coffee, tea, cocoa, artificial honey, sweets, fruit, poultry, game, or smoked foods. They could only buy vegetables such as rutabaga, cabbage, and beets. In 1942, the Nazis added more banned items, including meat and meat products, eggs, wheat products, whole milk, and even skim milk. Also, the times at which Jews could shop usually limited to 1 or 1.5 hours a day at closing time, which meant that non-Jews had already purchased most of the necessary foods. The Nazis had brutally replaced voluntary Jewishness, whether defined in terms of food traditions or family holidays, with racial repression, squeezing the remaining Jews together in, quote, Jew houses to make further persecution swift and efficient. Those lucky enough to flee Germany left harassment and subjugation behind, but faced nagging uncertainty in places of refuge. In many cases, they did not know how long it would take to move on or whether they could stay in their new refuge. 2 examples, these are only small examples that I have worked on, refugees in Portugal and in the Dominican Republic, can show the tenacity of food culture as well as the adaptability of the refugees. In both cases, families rarely functioned as engines of cultural continuity, since only the rare family managed to get all members out. In Lisbon, Portugal, for example, refugees from Germany waited until their visas and ship passages to the US, Latin America, or Britain came through. Some stayed months or years. Those who remained only a few weeks or months made daily visits to cafes, similar to those they had frequented in Germany or Austria, and ate Portuguese food that they could afford. An interesting mixture of German and Portuguese customs resulted. Irene Schomburg, whose parents had immigrated and settled in Portugal, remembered that her family got used to the salted, dried cod, a staple of the Portuguese cuisine and its most popular food. Her mother would boil it and add potatoes, tomatoes, onions, fish, and saute the mix. One could also include hard-boiled eggs and make different varieties. The Portuguese, Schomburg recalled, believed you could make a different version every day of the year. Every Friday, the Portuguese Jewish community, which consisted of a fairly large number of German, Dutch, and Portuguese Jews, had a bacalhau, lunch, which is cod. Yet the German element remained. They had beautiful cakes from, quote, strictly German recipes. Friday night dinners at home consisted of the traditional German Jewish chicken soup and chicken, quote, a Jewish meal, not Portuguese. Passover, too, had a German touch. Matzah balls, made with matzah, served as a side dish, basically a form of potato dumpling, turned into matzah dumpling. Ultimately, those who just passed through Portugal retained some of their German foods and adapted to their new land's cuisines, retaining little of the Portuguese flavor. Similarly, in the Dominican Republic, where about 800 Jews wound up on a collective farm in Sosua, the Central European Jews preferred to mix their traditional foods and Dominican specialties. Settlers appreciated the profusion of tropical fruits and vegetables, most of which they had never seen before. The dining hall provided breakfast and dinner. Breakfast consisted of bread, cheese, and marmalade similar to what they'd eaten in Europe, but also oranges, limes, bananas, eggs, sausage, and, quote, excellent Dominican coffee. Dinners included beef and chicken as the main proteins, with only the first a European staple. Pork appeared regularly. Again, this was a joint distribution committee group, and they had them not only eating pork, but they had them bringing, making a pig farm to sell pork. The settlers also raised many, many pigs. Dominican rice and beans, yuca, plantains, bread, sweet potatoes, corn, and seasonal items such as pineapples, mangoes, or avocado made up side dishes. Familiar with heavy Austrian and German foods, the refugees took a while to accustom themselves to Dominican fare. As sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has reminded us, food reflects directly back to the oldest and deepest experiences. Thus, the older refugees clung to traditional foods even though the tropical climate worked against them. For example, these formerly middle-class Germans required meat, something working-class Germans hadn't eaten every day. Yet with almost no refrigeration, one had to cook meat on the same day the animals were slaughtered. This could cause major inconveniences. In addition, the tropical climate prevented the cultivation of potatoes, the Central European staple, and the local equivalent, yuca, had to serve instead. While the younger people adjusted quite well to the varieties of ways yuca could be served, older settlers found that whether, quote, squashed, fried, ground, baked, or broiled, they always came out tasting like soap. Ernest Weinberg, at 10 years old when he arrived in Sosua, liked, quote, rice and beans, fried meat, especially goat, yellow and green plantains. His younger brother enjoyed them too, but his parents expressed shock having expected European potatoes, meat, and sauce. Quote, everything appeared strange to them. In December 1942, American doctors, they sound like your doctors, American doctors working at the Hebrew University visited the settlers and noted the people who used the dining hall rather than cooking on their own little homesteads, quote, still ate more or less as they had in Vienna. The visitors, aware of similar food preferences among refugees in Palestine, expressed concern that the settlers' meat consumption, 3 times the normal requirement for protein, could, quote, be harmful in a tropical climate. Thus, they recommended a, quote, radical reorganization of the menu, with more milk and cheese, less pork, and other, to their palate, greasy and indigestible foods. Finally, the doctors observed a, quote, inordinately high rate of sugar consumption in the settlement, not related to the canning or preserving industries which the settlement had created. 2 local cafes established by refugees continued to delight settlers with their sweet European indulgences. Eventually, the homesteaders learned to substitute yuca, plantains, sweet potatoes, and rice for European bread and potatoes. They even adapted recipes brought by the older generation to create interesting mixtures. Observers noticed them, quote, preparing the novel and unaccustomed food in the traditional native way, but adapting them to familiar recipes brought from the homeland. Thus, the Dominican visitor is delighted to find, instead of his familiar boiled yuca, appetizing yuca pancakes, green mangoes substitute for the familiar applesauce, and green papaya is put up as sweet and pungent pickle. For those few who remained in the Dominican Republic for their lifetimes, they and their children gradually adopted to Dominican foods, but Passover remained an important community holiday. German Jewish foodways in permanent exile, for example in the United States, require much more research. Returning to my mother's little gray metal box, stuffed with newspaper clippings and 3-inch by 5-inch index cards, I can observe how one young German Jewish woman arriving in 1936 at the age of 22 attempted to integrate American foods as well as Jewish American foods of Eastern European heritage into her Central European repertoire. I can do this by analyzing what she collected in that box, as well as the change over time in her use of English rather than German, and the names of the friends, European or American Jewish, whose recipes she copied. She did not keep recipes of her most frequently cooked meals, the meat and potatoes of the German, but also the American palate, since she knew them by heart. Nor did she note the timing of meals, which due to American work schedules changed radically from the heavy German midday meal to the main meal at the end of the day. Indeed, even the German daily, quote, coffee hour from 4 to 5 suffered drastic modification, occurring only on weekends. Central European dishes, almost all desserts, show up in the recipe box, especially at the beginning of her married life at age 30, and because her husband preferred desserts. So did her daughter. Still, using some German, she wrote this recipe for Zitronencreme, lemon cream, for example, in English and German, and gave German titles to Mürbe cookies, Austrian crescent-shaped cookies, Kipferl, made of nuts, and Viennese Topfentorte, a light cheesecake, while listing ingredients in English. The recipe for apricot sponge cake, given its German name, Aprikosenbiskuit, came from a Viennese friend, and she wrote out aprikosen marmalade in awkward English. Obviously a fan of apricots, she also included an American dish named Apricot Delight, whipped. The latter included Jell-O, which is a kind of a gelatin dessert, which reached its high point of sales in the 1950s. I'll let you look at it. She wasn't a great cook. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that. Including those with vegetables in them. Now, Jell-O has sugar in it. It's gelatin, fake color, and sugar that they poured over vegetables. She also did something called beet ring with yellow lemon Jell-O and cucumber supreme mold up there. She served innumerable varieties of glowingly colored fruit Jell-O or vegetable mold at large family gatherings in the 1950s. Along with this penchant for Jell-O, she tried out other American foods, for example, green bean casserole and tuna fish salad, completely foreign to her German tastes. She wrote the tuna recipe in German, carefully noting to mix in finely chopped celery. Some years later, she more easily penned the English instruction for Yankee pot roast and chicken noodle loaf. She also adopted Thanksgiving, the great American festive meal, with roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, stuffing, sweet potatoes, cornbread, and gravy, but no ham, often served in American families alongside turkey. German cakes replaced the traditional Thanksgiving apple and pumpkin pies. Attempting to acquire some American Jewish dishes, she saved recipes from the National Council of Jewish Women. For example, gefilte fish mold with sour cream and cucumber topping. She also clipped Blintz's Delight from Hadassah magazine and included Blintz's souffle to be served with defrosted frozen strawberries. An American Jewish friend's handwritten recipe for baked Blintzes also found its place in the little metal box, as did a clipping for baked noodles and cheese, really a recipe for Luxchenkugel, a sweet noodle casserole and staple among Eastern European Jews. Importantly, she collected a significant number of Passover recipes. Her notes on matzah rolls, written in English, actually gives the ingredients for what she later referred to as matzah balls. Matzah pancakes, spelled in German, and a clipping in English for Hezekiah matzah brie, an egg dish, further enhanced the Passover collection. A filbert's cake of hazelnuts, made with egg whites, nuts, and sugar, and no flour, would remain a Passover tradition in her home. She seemed very eager to acquire American Jewish Passover recipes, hence the recipe for matzah apple shallot, mocha sponge cake, and Passover walnut cake with chocolate sauce that she saved from Jewish newspapers. Her enthusiasm for these recipes included the sugar ad entitled, "The Cake Good Enough to Deserve Rabbi Levy's Blessings," Passover orange sponge cake made with Domino sugar. So it was an ad, but it also had a recipe. Her interest in American Jewish cooking, however, did not mean that she kept a kosher home, something her parents continued to do in the U.S. Despite avoiding pork products, with the occasional exception of bacon, at home, Her recipe box contained a shrimp dip, shrimp marinated, shrimp tomato rings, as well as shrimp mold with the ubiquitous gelatin ingredient. Over about 30 years, while loyal to German meat and potatoes as an everyday staple, she had branched out in both linguistic and culinary terms, adding what she saw as American and American Jewish dishes to her expanding cuisine. Clearly, her recipes also indicate the importance of family holidays like Passover. Having lost many family members in the Holocaust, holiday gatherings may have taken on extra meaning, reaffirming the remnants of former families. She gathered the family for Passover to maintain the religious tradition for her parents, but also to pass on to her children a familial religious culinary tradition important to her. For this holiday, she sought to acculturate to American Jewish recipes, with the exception of those northern German matzo balls that I mentioned earlier. Whereas we can certainly not generalize from one person, this trajectory offers some ideas about the possibilities of food flexibility and food fusion among the newly arrived German Jews. In sum, then, German Jewish foodways showed adaptability to their surrounding cultures and lands. Jews adjusted with verve to the dessert delights of Central European cultures, willingly called Passover Easter, and mixed Sabbath challah with mostly non-kosher meat. They nevertheless retained an aversion to pork and some pork products, and maintained family holidays even when they neglected Jewish food rituals. In lands of refuge, they familiarized themselves with newly available foods, from Portuguese fish to Dominican plantains, but retained what they could of the German diet and sought ritual foods for the Jewish holidays. And finally, in the United States, our one sample, my mother, continued in good German Jewish tradition to embrace the essence of the German diet, meat, potatoes, and dessert, while reaching out to American and particularly American Jewish food cultures. Thanks.